All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to our the Maryland Center on Economic Policy's annual Understanding the Governor's Budget webinar. If you are not familiar with us, MDCP is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think and do tank that believes that every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. We do this work in a variety of ways through research and analysis, public education, coalition building, and working in Annapolis. And we're also part of a number of national coalitions that we work in, some of which you see on the screen here. I am not going to go into all the detail about each of those, but certainly if you're interested, we can talk about them offline. We have a lot of material to cover today, and so I want to really jump into it. But before I do, just a quick reminder, if you have questions, we are doing this in webinar format today, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions, and once we're done presenting our material, we will do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can in the time that remains. And that is the one logistics piece I wanted to make sure to remind folks of. We are talking today about the state budget and why do we care? We care about state budgets because they really are the clearest indicator of what our values are as a state or as a community. Fiscal policy, whether we're talking about state budget expenditures or we're talking about our tax policy, is a matter of justice, and it's a matter of how we really show whether or not we mean what we say when we say that we care about every Marylander. We also care about state government and state spending because public spending is a critical part of our state's economy and every state's economy. The impact of federal, state, and local governments on local economies as employers, as consumers of goods provided in the private marketplace, and as a backstop when people are struggling to make ends meet is tremendous. I want to first jump into just a very quick overview of what the budget process is and kind of where we were at in it. The governor has introduced his $70 billion state budget, and the legislature is now taking a look at it, holding hearings in both the Senate and the House of Delegates, and will eventually pass a budget out of both chambers, where eventually both chambers will have agreed on a budget that will be passed and then go into effect in July 1st. In that process, each house will make changes to the governor's proposal. Those changes may be similar, they may be different, and eventually they're going to have to come together and negotiate over what those changes are before passing a balanced budget. And in the midst of all this, I think the other most important piece to know about our budget process is that in March we will get new revenue estimates that may change the conversation that we're having about the state's budget and what it takes in order to balance our budget for the following year. The larger context is also important, I think. We have long-term fiscal challenges as a state where, while we balance our budget every year as required by our state constitution, our expenses are growing faster than our revenues. And so last year the legislature and the governor had to figure out how to close a $3 billion shortfall. They did that. But in the context of federal layoffs, funding cuts, the federal shutdown, and now potentially a second partial shutdown, And as our economy it becomes weaker, the need for certain state services is increased. Our current shortfall that the governor had to figure out how to solve before introducing his budget, and that the legislature is grappling with now, is $1.5 billion. These projected shortfalls grow larger in future years, as you can see on the graph here. And the different lines represent how those estimates have changed based on before the last legislative session, after the last legislative session, and then before the current legislative session, or the dark blue is where our current understanding of the challenge the state faces. Um, as I mentioned, there are only a few ways to do this to address those shortfalls. You either have to um, cut expenditures, or you have to raise new revenues. And um, as you may have seen, the governor and legislative leaders this year have made it clear that they are not willing to consider new taxes or fees. So the budget gap is addressed entirely through cuts. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. How has the governor addressed the shortfall in his version of the budget? So there are a number of strategies the governor's used here. He has, in particular, used cash from special funds, especially the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, as well as a few others, to move up to almost $300 million from a fund for clean energy projects and energy assistance. He's also moved costs out of the operating budget and into the capital budget, using debt to pay for things that we might usually pay for using cash on hand. He has also in his budget not made a required payment to state our rainy day fund, or our reserve fund, our savings account, as you will. Um, and So those are some of the ways we've moved money around. He has also proposed shifting more costs to local government. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Musab's going to talk about that. There are changing the requirement. There are proposals the governor's put forward to change the requirements for programs for people with developmental disabilities that would reduce demand for those services, or reduce the number of people who um, uh, qualify, or the level of service that was being provided. And that saves $150 million in state funds. It also we lose matching federal funds by making that reduction, but it helps the governor balance his budget. And also keeping funding levels in a number of programs, including Medicaid provider rates and the Child Care Scholarship Program, flat. And the Child Care Scholarship Program, for example, has had a wait list that is unlikely to get better if we keep funding flat. There are areas where the governor has proposed new investments. There is a state match to federal corporate tax breaks that were part of House HR 1, or otherwise known as the One Big Beautiful Bill, which is not so beautiful. But this big package that Republicans in Congress and the Trump administration put together back in the summer included a number of changes that would automatically flow down to state tax policy unless we disconnect those connections. And the governor has not done that at the federal with some of these federal corporate tax breaks. There are included in that bill were a lot of changes to SNAP and Medicaid that we could spend a lot of uh, time talking about on a different call, but the state does have to comply with the law, and so we have to invest new state dollars in complying and upgrading our systems to comply with those changes. There are a number of economic grants that are the governor is arguing will um, spur economic development. The biggest couple being for AstraZeneca, pharmaceutical company, um, for the construction of a version of the Las Vegas Sphere at National Harbor, as well as a number of investments in quantum computing companies. Um, the governor has also, not surprisingly, put money into what I think we can call his signature policy proposal to reduce childhood poverty, the Enough Act. And there's additional money in the governor's proposal going into local policing. Uh, Overall, the governor has both presented a balanced budget for the year under consideration. He has also reduced the size of the budget problem for out years, but not by very much. And so we will continue to have these conversations going into future legislative sessions about future budgets and this uh, uh, disparity between the growth in our expenses and the growth in our revenues and the fairness of our tax system. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our staff, each of who is going to talk in a little bit more detail about a particular area or two. And we are going to begin with Tanika Richardson. She is going to talk about healthcare and housing. Tanika?
Thank you, Ben, for your introduction. Hello, everyone. So, real quick, I'll try to not take too long and just focus on the key highlights, but if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. Um, One of the things I want to point out is that healthcare continues to be one of the largest parts of the state budget, and it flexes ongoing operating tax, for as demand and services, and also, a rise in costs here. The budget does continue to prioritize Medicaid and behavioral health as core components of state spending. As currently proposed, the budget does include about 1.7 billion for provider reimbursements, which was overall like a major key component of the overall housing budget. There's also funding for HR 1 implementation, which is a new requirement that's going to take effect at the end of the calendar year. Um, these changes will require additional state administrative capacity and system upgrades to ensure compliance and expanded access. Approximately about 56 million in state funds are also allocated to implement part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act provisions, which includes, unfortunately, Medicaid administrative requirements. It's not related changes. Um, the budget also did provide some funding for the governor's Healthy Babies and Equity Act. This act ensures that immigrant pregnant women and children remain qualified for Medicaid coverage. And this particular act continues Maryland's commitments to further improve maternal infant health. However, um, unfortunately, due to the current climate, there was a pause on the additional immigrant coverage expansion. So previously, there was a program planned that would have allowed undocumented immigrants to purchase private health insurance on the exchange. However, that is currently being paused. Until I guess until the state can figure out kind of what's going on the federal level with that administration. Um, Another takeaway was that there currently in the budget there's no increased rates to be paid to providers who accept Medicaid. And this can obviously, unfortunately, have an impact when it comes to people having access to services. All right, next slide. Okay, when it comes to housing, looking at the budget, most of the affordable housing funds from the state are coming from the development side and are part of the capital budget. These funds primarily support construction and preservation of current affordable rental housing, rehab projects, infrastructure, and things of that nature. State affordable housing strategy remains heavily oriented currently right now on the development side. So, reviewing the budget, there are a lot of different projects that are being financed by bonds, low income housing tax credits, gap financing for mixed income developments, and there are several ongoing capital projects that are supported by bonds as well. Um, while the development for funding on the housing side is kind of focused towards developing, the budget does include some operating costs for current housing programs such as state rental assistance and voucher programs, permanent supportive housing initiatives. Um, uh, I did look because I was trying to get a dollar amount, but reviewing the budget because I know people are going to ask. There currently is not, at least I have not seen a specific line item for eviction prevention funds directly. I know that is something that we can talk about afterwards that we are advocating for in this session, but there are some safety net programs that are funded at current levels. Uh, So yeah, so overall, the budget, protects, the core healthcare and housing commitments, but does so in a constrained physical environment. Healthcare remains the largest portion of the budget, yet provider rates are flat and some expansions are paused. In housing, the state continues to prioritize building and preserving affordable units, while operating supports like rental assistance remain limited. These choices highlight the ongoing tension between the rising needs and limited resources. And now I will hand it off to my colleague, Chris, who will talk to you about education and revenue.
Thank you, Tanika. So, starting off with pre-K through 12 education, which is the second largest component of our state budget. The governor's budget does fully fund all the main education aid formulas, things that just go straight to public schools. That is good news. There is also money set aside in the governor's budget to protect schools from losing funding due to changes in the way that student poverty is measured and expiration of certain temporary fixes there. So that isn't really additional new funding, but it is funding above what the law requires in order to prevent losses. Um, Schools are also dealing with declining enrollment in general, which is something that Maryland is seeing alongside many other states. And the governor's budget does not include additional funds to prevent potential funding losses from that, although the extent of that isn't very certain. One cut in the governor's budget is $20 million cut from what's called the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports. So that is a partnership between school systems and Medicaid to give grants to private providers to partner on mental health services for students. Last year, the adopted budget cut that by $30 million. This is an additional $20 million cut. So that's a total of $50 million per year ongoing cut from this program, or a 38% cut altogether. Another issue with school funding is that inflation has, in recent years, as we all know, outpaced uh, what lawmakers were expecting when they passed a major school funding reform in 2021, the Blueprint for Maryland's Future. So while that was intended as a plan to significantly increase funding for Maryland schools, because of the way that those formulas work, increased inflation has essentially chipped away at the power of those reforms. And then one of the major issues in school funding is that the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund, that provides a growing share of our education funding, is facing major deficits in future years that ultimately will require either significant cuts to public education or other public services or significant new revenues. Moving on to higher education, there is a 3% cap placed on funding growth for community colleges and other state institutions. And then also the state is flat funding support for that provides financial aid essentially for Maryland students at private universities. Changing gears a bit to talk about the revenue situation. So as Ben mentioned, pretty much all decision makers in the budget process have indicated that they're not interested in raising new revenue through taxes or fees this year. But there are some decisions that were made about how to interact with HR Run, the one big brutal bill, as I like to say. So Governor Moore did decouple from some of the business tax cuts in that bill. There is a tax cut for certain manufacturing property that the governor did decouple from, which gets us $123 million over what we would have lost. We are also maintaining $10 million in revenue from decoupling from a provision that allows businesses to fully expense certain investments up front. But the governor is coupling on to certain aspects of certain tax cuts in the bill for businesses, namely $100 million in tax cuts for research and experimental expenditures by businesses, and then $28 million in tax cuts for business interest. Another issue not addressed in the governor's budget is the state and local tax deduction. The HR 1 increased the cap on that deduction from $10,000 a year to $40,000. We don't have exact numbers, but that likely costs around $150 million a year, and the governor's budget does not address that. All right, and with that, I will pass it on to Nonzo.
Thank you, Chris. Pleasure to be with all of you. Like Ben mentioned previously, we're talking about the impact of the HR1 on SNAP particularly. But before that, I wanted to mention that to talk about some of the changes that are coming with HR1 that will be impacting SNAP. Specifically, one of them is age range expansions that will be moving the age range for work requirements, expanding that from 18 to 54 to 18 to 64, which will be gonna brings in approximately 80,000 more Marylanders on the mandates. There's also stricter child exemptions. Previously, children were exempt if the parents were exempt if they had children under 18. Under HR1, that exemption is now limited to those with children under the age of 7. There's also the elimination of vulnerable groups exemption, and this is a law that the law has removed previously those who were had previous exemptions like veterans, individuals experiencing homelessness, and former foster youth under 24. Those groups must now meet work requirements as well. So what does this mean in terms of a SNAP and it relates to the budget? One area that I think is important to mention here is the administrative cost of SNAP. Previously, it was shared between the federal and state, 50% cost share. But with HR1 starting on October 1st, the states will now incur about 75% of the cost, and with the federal government covering 5%, so about a 25% increase. So what that means is that the state now has to increase some of its cost sharing burden falls on the state. So in the budget last year in FY 2026, it was about 115 million cost share now, with the state absorbing some of that cost of a SNAP administration. the state now has to allocate about 43.1 million to be able to do SNAP administrative costs. The other area that I wanted to speak about is the child care scholarship. As Ben mentioned previously in his introduction, the costs from previous year FY 2026 was about 414 million, and this year that cost remains the same. So the cost just remains flat for this for the childcare scholarship, which means two things: is that as we saw last year, there has been wait lists because the number of enrollments has gone beyond the 42,000 cap. So with the budget remaining steady and sustaining from FY 2026, we expect that that particular wait list will remain into this fiscal year. And with that, I will hand it over to Musab to talk about the local government as well as public safety.
Thank you, Nonzo, and thanks everyone again for signing up. So let's get into the public safety budget for the governor for FY 27. The governor has said that this is a top priority. Public safety almost always is a top priority in most state governments. So this year in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, their budget is up about 4.75% from fiscal 2026. One notable allocation in the Governor's Office of Crime and Prevention is the announcement of 35 million in the funding for the Victims of a Crime Act. So that paired with federal funding brings the total fund to 80 million. The overall funding for local police jurisdictions is up about 2 million, which is only a 2.5% increase from the prior year. It's just reflective of fiscal the fiscal tightening in this budget. Nonetheless, the aid for police did increase by 2 million. There's also money in an increase in the Department of Juvenile Services targeted youth support systems and programs. One allocation is for the Thrive Academy, which is a gun violence reduction initiative, and then there's funding for community-based services addressing detention and rehabilitation. And then there's in general the capital budget is for this year I think it's 52 million, which largely goes to fund uh, facilities and the improvements of those facilities. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then moving on to local governments, the total state aid to local governments is up about 3.3%. This is mostly due to school funding. There was a increase above the mandated amount that was highlighted in the governor's budget. But additionally, there's also slight retirement costs in the increase in retirement shifted between the state and local governments. So now the local governments are taking 50% of that cost increase. So that translates to about 36 million for pensions for teachers, or sorry, 36 million, and then 2.3 million for community colleges and 700,000 for libraries. Additionally, the funding for local health departments is essentially flat. There's 0% growth in this year's budget, and transportation funding as well has grown only about 0.1%. And this is the current outlook for the budget right now, but this is for the local aid is all inclusive of 110 million in proposed cuts. So if those cuts do get enacted, then these cost shifts will be shifted onto the local government. And other than that, I will hand it off to Callie to talk about budget advocacy.
Great. Thank you, Musab. Sorry, I'm also managing the slides. There we go. So just wanted to take a few minutes to touch on, we're giving an overview of what the governor's proposals are. But there's still a lot of process that will happen in the legislature, and all of us, as Marylanders, have the ability to have our say in what we think the priority should be. So I think, as is the case with any kind of advocacy, I think the best place to start is talking to the people who represent you in your district, your delegates and your senators. They're the ones that are elected to represent your interests. So whether they are serving on the budget committees or not, I think it's just important to share with them what issues you care about, what funding is necessary for your community. Um, there are also opportunities throughout the next month or so. Every state agency and kind of sub-agency, so each department has its own budget hearing. So I will share links in the chat in a few moments, but you can find the schedule on the General Assembly website of when all the hearings are. And the same as you can with a piece of legislation, you can submit written testimony or sign up to testify on parts of the budget that you care about, and any cuts that you're concerned about, or things that aren't getting funding that you think should be. That's a great way to highlight those. And then the last option, which is particularly helpful if you're representing an organization, but also as an individual, it's fine to reach out to. So the budget is a little different than a single piece of legislation, and that there are subcommittees focusing on different areas of the budget. So in the House of Delegates, the Appropriations Committee is the committee that oversees the budget, and there are subcommittees for different topic areas. So for health, um, transportation, education, each of those has a subcommittee, and it will just have a few legislators in it, and they're the ones who are really digging deep into those issue areas and have a really deep understanding of those parts of the budget, and are sometimes the best ones to flag issues to, if you have a concern or an ask about a certain part of the budget. So yeah, just wanted to share those tips and make sure, as we're talking about the budget, that folks also have an opportunity to weigh in. And I will pass it back to Ben. We have plenty of time left for Q&A. So if you have questions about things that we have not touched on, and we've been talking about things at a high level, I think Ben is going to facilitate our Q&A.
Thanks, Kelly. Yes, definitely continue to put your questions in the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. I think, Chris, I'm going to start with a question for you about education funding. And there's a question, are there any future plans to phase out blueprint funding?
There are not future plans that are, in public to phase out blueprint funding. Last year, you may be aware that the adopted budget did slightly roll back some of the blueprint commitments for public school funding for the first time. This year, nobody is proposing major cuts like that. But ultimately, because dedicated funding for public schools through the Blueprint Fund is going to be falling short of required expenditures. That does ultimately mean that, they really have a three-way choice of cutting back on planned support for public schools, cutting back significantly on other public services, or raising new revenues. So there are no existing plans, but they really only have a few choices about how to address those deficits.
Thanks. Nan, so I think the next question I have is for you, and it relates to the Child Care Scholarship Program. We talked about how state funding for the Child Care Scholarship is flat, but that the federal government is providing more dollars for the program. And so the question is two-part. First being just what is the source of those additional federal funds, if you know that offhand. And then secondly, do we have a sense of what the impact will be on the childcare scholarship wait list? Is it going to help reduce the wait list? Is it going to remain the same as inflation eats up the increase, or what's kind of the expected impact on the wait list?
So to answer the question, Ben, I think first of all we expect the childcare scholarship funding to remain on the state side, as we mentioned previously, it's supposed to be steady from FY 2026. There's also anticipation for funding from the federal side. I don't know offhand now the figure for that funding. I'll look that up and send when that's available. But there's anticipation of funding. The in terms of whether that would impact the slots that's available and impact the waiting list, the expectation is that it might be able to do that, but we're not yet quite sure on that yet. So it's still open to, there's no concrete answer to that at the moment.
Thanks, Don. So, Callie, maybe I can address this next question to you about the Energy Assistance Fund and what we understand is the impact going to be of transferring those funds out of the Strategic Energy Assistance Fund into the uh, operating budget for other purposes at a time when energy bills are becoming more and more unaffordable. What are we hearing about that?
Yeah, so there is a lot of money in that fund. It primarily comes from, my understanding is alternative payments for rather than utility companies and others like directly investing in clean energy themselves. They're giving the money to the state in this fund. So there's a good amount of money built up in that fund. So there is part of the governor's budget. He does have some money set aside to do a second round of bill rebates um, for energy bills, similar to what they did last year. It's not, I think some folks have concerns about it because it's not targeted by income. It's not going specifically to lower income ratepayers. It just goes to everyone, and therefore it doesn't end up being a huge amount of money per person. But there is some money going to that, and I think, long term there are concerns, and I think there will be a lot of dialogue throughout the legislative session about just because we have a lot of money built up in this fund, it was like the reason that we have a special fund for this is because the legislature decided that we needed money for for those purposes, and should we be rating it to just spend on other things versus finding ways to invest in um, lowering bills and clean energy programs that support households. So I think we'll see how that conversation goes this session. I know a lot of folks are going to be talking about that.
But I think I'm going to direct this next question to myself. But there's a question about there's a conversation going around on nationally and here in Maryland about whether or not Maryland might keep some of its own money that it would otherwise send to the federal government uh, in response to federal budget cuts or in some cases retaliatory actions in other states in particular. And the question is somewhat logistical in that, like, how would that be operationalized, and how would the legislature go about doing that? And that's a interesting conversation. It's not super clear to me yet how you might structure something that would pass muster, pass legal muster. Um, One important context for that conversation here in Maryland is, unlike New York or California, Maryland does receive more in federal funds than it sends to the federal government. So where California has a sends something like $275 billion more to the federal government than it receives back. Maryland receives about $25 billion more in federal funds than we send to Washington. Um, and Partly because of our proximity to the state and how much how many federal agencies are based in Maryland, et cetera. Um, so the context here in Maryland is a little bit different than in some of the other states where this has been discussed. But if the legislature wanted to do something like this, certainly they would need to change law to make that happen as a regular bill that would, unlike the budget bill, which has to pass the legislature before they can close out the session and then goes into effect without whether the governor signs it or not. Uh, Something like that would require both being passed by the legislature and signed off on by the governor. There's also lots of questions about how you would even effectuate that. I think the clearest tool that the state would have would be to withhold federal tax payments that are supposed to be made on behalf of state employees. But that's a very small fraction of the total uh, tax dollars paid by Marylanders to the federal government. So um, I'm sure lots of other smart people are thinking about this in lots of other ways, but I think that that's some important context to think about. And it wouldn't, if the other part of the question was, well, then how would you adjust the budget? And I think probably what it would require would be either it might not show up in the budget itself this year. It would be more like written into the bill would be some what would happen with the dollars in future years. And It probably would be prudent to set those dollars aside into a special fund, given the likelihood of legal challenges to any withholding of those federal dollars. So I don't know that I wouldn't say that's like a magic bullet for our state's budget challenges right now. Um, all right, looking at other questions, going back to the Q&A, certainly keep them coming. We may not get out to all of them, but we will do our best. There was a question, and Kelly, I'm going to turn back to you actually for the next question, asking about, so we know that the governor and legislative leadership has said that they're not interested in any tax increases to help balance the budget on the revenue side of the ledger. But are there bills introduced, regardless of those statements, that might provide meaningful revenue and which might, is there any sense that they might get traction as the implications of an all cuts budget approach start hitting home?
That is an excellent question. Say, Maryland Center on Economic Policy, I will quickly plug a coalition that we are a part of called Fair Share Maryland that is working to make our tax system more equitable and ensure that our state has the resources long term for our communities and families in the state to thrive. You can find more information about that coalition at fairsharemaryland.org, and that coalition has supported some major revenue legislation in the past couple years. I think we're not expecting anything of that scale to be introduced this year, or what we've seen. There are a number of smaller revenue bills that have come in. Some bills looking at giving local governments more flexibility in how they can raise revenue and potentially do so in a more equitable way. They have much more limited tools than the state has, and they need permission from the state to use different tools. And, as more state costs are getting potentially pushed down to the local governments, that is one thing that is important. I think there'll potentially, be separate legislation or conversation through the budget process about the decoupling issues that Chris was talking about whether or not we do a state match of all the corporate tax breaks that were part of HR1, and that could produce some additional revenue without being a new tax. And there are some other things along that vein. I think there is a bill that was put in, I think just last week. Looking at the state has tax breaks for data centers that are becoming quite costly. And so looking at scaling those back, like, do we really need to be? There's already a lot of private incentives and private money going into data centers. Do we need to be offering a state tax break on top of that? So those are some of the things that I'm aware of right now at this point. I don't expect that we'll see any of the larger revenue proposals that we've seen the past couple of years. In addition, to the Fair Share Act, the last couple of years, the legislature has also looked at sales tax changes and like a sugary drinks tax and some like environmental fees, a number of other things that they've looked at that would be bigger pieces of revenue that as far as I am aware of, are not going to be back this session.
Thanks, Kelly. I, I want to go back to the previous question that I was talking about withholding federal dollars, and I think I just wanted to be clear in my answer that so I was trying to talk about the ways in which the state might attempt to do that. I really doubt, I really don't think that there's any actual way for the state to withhold those federal dollars. Um, People are creative and come up with all sorts of things, but and unique creative strategies. But I am skeptical of the success of any of those succeeding or being effective. So I just wanted to clarify that in case my previous answer wasn't as clear. Nanso, you wanted to circle back to the question about childcare subsidies again and talk about where the federal funding was coming from.
Yes, Ben. So yes, I think I forgot to respond to that. So the funding for that is coming from the Child Care Development Block Grant, CCBG. So that's where most of the federal funding will be coming from. So I realized I didn't respond to that when you forgot to respond to that.
Okay, thank you. Callie, we have another process question, and that I think you might be able to answer here. Looking at if you're interested in a specific project that is in the governor's budget and you want to comment on that project, how do you figure out what the specific hearing or date for that hearing is? How do you figure out how to submit testimony regarding the specific project? And you know, you shared some of the in the chat, you shared the schedule for various hearings, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about how to figure out in the you know, hundreds of different programs that the state is holding, that the legislature is holding budget hearings on. How do you find the one that you are most interested in?
And yeah, that is tricky and I probably oversimplified. Um, so I think there's some things will be more obvious what department oversees them. So I think generally if something's a health program, and you're not sure what sub-agency of the health um the Maryland Department of Health oversees that program, there is an opportunity to put in testimony on kind of the overall agency budget. So like in the example of health, it's listed as MDH administration. Um, so that is one option if you're not sure. If you're working with an organization or you're connected with an organization that works on that specific issue, like asking folks within that organization, they might know what part of the budget it falls under. You can also search through the budget documents, which are very not user friendly. They, you can sometimes find things through keyword search. And there's the Department of Budget and Management's website that can tell you what department it falls under. Um, but yeah, sometimes it's just, over time, if you're interested in a specific issue, following up. And that's why I think if you're not sure, starting with your own legislators and telling them that you care about an issue, they might be able to help you find that out too, like their legislative staff or their office, um, would potentially be able to help you figure out what it falls under. That link that I shared, Department of Legislative Services, which is kind of independent staff that does analyses on the budget and legislation for the General Assembly. They um, they do analyses for each of those budgets that will provide more detail. It's a little still pretty wonky and detailed, but more accessible than just trying to read a state budget book. Unfortunately, those analyses usually don't go up until a day or two before the budget hearing. But um, if you're just following the budget and not sure how to weigh in this year, that can be a way to get more information about what's happening with the budget. And then you can always email comments to legislators if you can't get in a written testimony for a hearing. And the testimony will be due 2 business days before the hearing happens, the same as a bill. Um, yeah, I think those are the main ways. And the one other thing I find there is a bill where called the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. So anything that is in the governor's budget proposal that requires a change in uh, statute and change in formula. So most of the things that are cuts will require the legislature to sign off of them. They will be in that bill. And so submitting testimony on that bill to comment on any of the proposed cuts is another option as well. Um,
I would also say, outside of the legislative session, if you care about a program and are able to develop a relationship with the staff at the state within state government that administer that program, they can also be a resource, and collaboration is possible, um, as those budget hearings come up to be able to advocate within the process. So those relationship, in addition to partnering with organizations that are following this stuff directly, especially if you are at an organization, building that relationship with the staff tasked with implementing the program can be a long-term strategy in addition to the immediate strategies that Callie was highlighting. We are closing out our time together today, and really just want to thank everybody for coming out. I hope that each of you found this budget briefing to be informative, and that we've given you actionable intelligence about your priorities. Doing this work is only possible because of the support of our funders, our partner organizations, and people like you. And your support's even more critical at this moment when philanthropic priorities are shifting. If you're already a donor or you gave when you registered for this webinar, thank you so much. If you have found this information on this webinar helpful, but have not yet given, I'd ask that you please consider making a one-time donation or even setting up a monthly contribution via the link that we'll put in the chat. If you'd like to learn more, whether you give or not, if you'd like to learn more, check out our website at mdeconomy.org. Follow us on the various social media platforms, or you can always email us at mdcep@mdeconomy.org. Thank you again for joining, and have a great week.